Hello. Okay, hello everyone. Good morning. Welcome to lecture 3 of ELS 122 Psychology of Language. So for today's lesson, I will be discussing about the history, methods, themes, and controversies of psycholinguistics and even modern linguistics. So let's go start by understanding first the history and methods of psycholinguistics. Okay, so in understanding the history and methods of psycholinguistics, we have to understand first uh, a very brief knowledge, or we have to have a very brief knowledge of the history of psycholinguistics, or how does this field of study came about. So first, the history of psycholinguistics is a relatively short one, although it is often traced to a conference held in Cornell, USA in the summer of 1951. The use of the word psycholinguistics in Osgood and Seabook's 1944 book describing that conference, the approach was certainly used before then. So we can then say that, for example, Francis Galton studied word association in 1879 in Germany, and at the end of the 19th century, Meringer and Mayer in 1895 analyzed slips of the tongue in a remarkably modern way. And if we place the infancy of modern psycholinguistics sometimes around the American linguist Noam Chomsky in 1959 review of Skinner's book Verbal Behavior, then its adolescence would correspond to the period in the early of mid 1960s when psycholinguists tried to relate language processing to a transformational grammar. So since psycholinguistics have left its linguistic home and achieved independence, it's now flourishing on all its fronts. So the way psycholinguistics has evolved throughout the years um, has actually been based on our early psychological approaches to language saw the language processors as a simple device that could generate and understand sentences by moving from one state to another. So there are two strands in this early work to be found in information theory and behaviorism. Okay, but before that, let's talk about first the importance of how did psycholinguistics came about in two disciplines. First is psychology and linguistics, particularly in Chomsky's approach to linguistics. So linguistics is the study of language itself and the rules that describe it, and our knowledge about the rules of the language in modern linguistics, the primary data used by linguists are intuitions about what is and is not acceptable in a sentence. So for example, we know that um, we know that what you call this we know that, for example, we know that the string of words in uh, is acceptable, and we know that something is ungrammatical. So that is basically our own knowledge of what is and what is not linguistics. The primary concerns of early linguistics were rather different from what they are now. So comparative linguistics was concerned with comparing traces of origins of different languages. In particular, the American Bloomfieldian tradition emphasized um, comparative studies of indigenous North American Indian languages. Now, this led to an emphasis on what is called structuralism in the languages. In that, a primary concern was to provide an analysis of the appropriate categories of description of the units of language. But as time goes by, okay, our early psychological approaches to language saw the language processor as a simple device that could generate and understand sentences by moving one state to another. As mentioned, there are two strands in this early work of early psychological approaches to language. They are to be found in information theory and behaviorism. Okay, information theory emphasized the role of probability and redundancy in language and developed out of demands of the early telecommunication industry. While in the middle part of the 20th century, the dominant tradition in psychology was behaviorism. Now, this emphasized the relation between an input or stimulus or output or response, and how conditioning and reinforcement form these association. Intermediate constructs such as mind were considered unnecessary to provide a full account of behavior. So these two strands basically of psychology has influenced the development of psycholinguistics, especially in the understanding of language and how language works. So Chomsky showed that behaviorism was incapable of dealing with natural language. He argued that a new type of linguistic theory called transformational grammar provided both an account of the underlying structure of language and also of people's knowledge of their language. Now, psycholinguistics blossomed in attempting to test the psychological implication of this linguistic theory. The enterprise was not wholly successful, and experimental results indicated that although linguistics might tell us a great deal about our knowledge of our language and about the constraints of our own children's acquisition, it is limited in what it can tell about the processes involved in speaking and understanding. So there is a lot of things going on as to the debate on understanding language and language acquisition and how language works in people. That's why um, many have been trying to um, many have been trying to understand this interaction. That's why psycholinguistics came about. Okay, so let's continue. So psycholinguistics was largely absorbed into mainstream cognitive psychology in the 1970s. In this approach, the information processing or computational metaphor reigns supreme rather, and the central idea was that language tasks could be represented rather as flow diagrams. In the same way that complex tasks could be represented as flow diagrams before being turned into a computer program. And modern psycholinguistics is primarily an experimental science, and in as much of cognitive psychology, experiments measuring reaction times have been particularly important. And we try to break language processing down into its components and show how those components relate to each other. That's why in one of these in this chapter, in this part of this chapter, the brief history of psycholinguistics, we'll be talking about um, how people try to make something just to understand how language works in the brain of a people. Now let's talk about the approach called cognitive science. The term cognitive science is used to cover the multidisciplinary approach to the study of the mind, including adult and developmental psychology, philosophy, linguistics, anthropology, neuropsychology, and particularly artificial intelligence. So that's why people or researchers who try to emulate or copy how the human mind works to acquire, okay, and use language in a daily basis, um, try to emulate or aim to emulate a talking, listening, all seeing, thinking computer with some early successes that lead to great optimism that this was readily realizable goal. Okay, so some of them think that um, an AI or artificial intelligence can be achieved to emulate or to copy, okay, how humans communicate or use language on a daily basis. Among the earliest of these was Weizenbaum's program called ELIZA, and this simulated a non-directive Rogerian therapist. Now, in this program, it worked in a very simple way using a few tricks such as matching sentences to pre-stored structure or templates, producing predetermined responses to a few keywords such as mother, and repeating what was input to it back with a few appropriate changes in the word order. So it's just like um, asking um, asking the ELIZA program a question and it responds based on a template provided in the program. And then the next influential program was called SHRDLU. Okay. The name came from the letters of one row of a typesetting machine and was often used by typesetters to flag a mistake. And this program could answer questions about an imaginary world called Block's World. Black words are occupied by objects such as small red pyramids sitting on top of big blue cubes, and this program's success is being able to understand sentences such as move the small red pyramid on top of the blue cube was much hailed at the time. However, this program could only understand in as much as it could give an appropriate response to compared to the ELIZA program. And there is much more to understanding than this. And furthermore, these early demonstrations work only for very simple limited domains, and SHRDLU could not answer questions about elephants or even say what block means, and its knowledge was limited to the role of blocks within Block's world. So we have to understand that these programs were um, were early attempts and did have the virtue of demonstrating the enormity of the task in understanding the language. They also reveal the main problem that have to be solved before we can talk of computers truly understanding language. And there is an infinite number of sentences of varying degrees of complexities we can talk about and understand potentially anything. The roles that context and the world knowledge play in understanding are very important. Potentially anything might be necessary to understand a particular sentence. Now, the conventional AI approach had some influence on psycholinguistic theorizing, particularly on how we understand syntax and how we make inferences in story comprehension. Okay, let's continue. So now let's talk about the methods of modern psycholinguistics. Okay, there are methods on how to um, how to copy or how to take note of how our brain works in dealing with language and language acquisition and language processing. One of the most popular is what is called the priming methodology, and it has been used in almost all areas of psycholinguistics. The general idea is that if two things are similar to each other and involved in the same level of processing, they will either assist with or interfere with each other, but if they are unrelated, they will have no effect. For example, it is easier to recognize a word, for example, bread, if you have just seen a word that is related in meaning, as in butter. Now, this effect is called semantic priming. If priming causes processing to be speeded up, we talk about facilitation. If priming causes it to be slowed down, we talk of inhibition. So this is one of the few methodology in psycholinguistics in order to understand how language works and how language acquisition works. Okay, so new techniques of brain imaging are gradually becoming more accurate and more accessible in terms of understanding how the mind works in terms of language and language acquisition. A number of techniques for examining the brain's activity have been around for some time, and this include EEG and ERP, both of which measures the electrical activity of the brain by electrodes on the scalp. We also have CAT, MRI, and PET. Scans provide more accessible data in the form of pictures of the living brain, and disadvantages of the brain imaging are that these techniques are expensive and their temporal and spatial resolution are currently poor. So this is when the time when uh, we can't actually the technology is not at par with what we have now in the 20th century. Okay, but people have been trying to. However, a significant problem with current brain imaging is that the results are often difficult to interpret. That's why it is hard to be sure exactly what is causing any activity. And imaging will tell us where something is happening, but in itself, it does not tell us how or why something happens. The looking at how the brain Okay, looking at how the brain works is not the same thing as looking at how the mind works. In the context of a theory of language processing and brain structure, however, imaging might provide us important clues as to what is going on. So, but not necessarily tell us. but not necessarily tell us that how something is going on, especially in language and language processing. Now, psycholinguistic research does not differ from other types of psychology in the bias, but it's important because language here is the object of the study, not just the means of carrying out the experiment. It also has meant that there has been a great deal of research on reading, when for most people, speaking and listening are the main language activities in their lives. Fortunately, in recent years, this situation has changed dramatically, and we are now seeing the fruits of research on speech recognition, on language production, on speakers of different languages, on bilingual speakers, on people with brain damages, and on people across full range of lifespan. Okay, because before they they there is a problem as to the data where they get to analyze from, because some of the data are actually uh, for limited people only. So that's a problem there for some. Now let's talk about some of the themes and controversies in modern psycholinguistics. So these are the themes rather that um, psycholinguistics has to consider in the field. So first, to discover the processes involved in producing and understanding the language. Second, the question of whether apparently different language processes are related to one another, because there are different language processes, and we'll know about that later in the semester. Number three, whether or not processes in language operate independently of one another or whether they interact. And number four, mm, was it innate about what is innate about language? Is it innate or is it learned? Do we need to refer to explicit rules when considering language processes? How sensitive are the results of our experiments to be particular techniques employed? Number seven, what can be learned from looking at the language of people with damage to the parts of the brain that control language? Number eight, there are many thousands of languages in the world. And lastly, we should be able to apply psycholinguistic research to everyday problems, such as dyslexia, aphasia, and so on. So these are the themes, or these are the problems, or these are the main missions of psycholinguistic in understanding how and why language and language processes work in our brain. Okay, then let's talk about some of the controversies in psycholinguistics. The first one is how modular is language system. The concept of modularity is important in psycholinguistics because most people agree that processing can be described in terms of a number of levels of processing. Processing starts with an input, which is acted one by one or more intervening levels of processing to produce an output. There is much less agreement on the way in which these levels of processing are connected to each other. So how modular is it? Okay, let's see. A module is a self-contained set of processes. It converts an input to an output without any outside help on what goes on in between. Another way of putting this is that the processes inside a module are independent of the processes outside the module. Yet another way of describing it is to say that the processing is purely data driven. Now, models in which processing occurs in this way are called autonomous. And opposing views is that processing is interactive. So there are two types of modularity: autonomous and interactive. At the moment, the issue of modularity perhaps makes psycholinguists more agitated than anything else. And to the outsider, it is sometimes difficult to see why. According to many researchers, we should start with the assumption that processes are modular or non-interactive unless they are very good reasons to think otherwise. There are a number of reasons for this assumption. The first is simplicity. Modular models generally involve fewer processes and connections between systems, and the second is a belief that evolution favors a modular system. Another issue is that the question about is any part of language innate? So there are broader implications of modularity too. Generally, those researchers most committed to the claim that language processes are highly modular, okay, also argue that a great deal of our language capacity is innate. The argument is essentially that nice, clean-cut modules must be built into the brain and hardwired and therefore innately programmed, and that complex, messy systems must reflect the effects of learning. Connectionist modeling suggests ways in which general properties of the learning system can serve the role of innate, language specific knowledge and shows how behavior emerges from the interaction of nature and nurture as well. Another controversy is, does the language system make use of rules? To what extent does the language processing system make use of linguistic rules? So in traditional linguistics, much knowledge is encapsulated in the form of explicit rules. For example, we can describe the syntax of language in terms of rules such as a sentence can comprise a noun, phrase, followed by a verb phrase. Similarly, we can formulate a rule that the plural of a noun is formed by adding an suffix s to its end, except in a limited number of irregular forms. But do we actually make use of such rules when speaking and listening? Until quite recently, the answer was thought to be yes. But many researchers, particularly those with a more linguistic orientation, still believe this. And recently, the situation has changed greatly with the influence of connectionist modeling. That's why there is a problem. This is an issue in psycholinguistics because some believe or some think that language is a very complex system, and understanding the brain and how it make use of the language system or even apply its rules is very complicated as well. That's why it's a very interesting field of study in linguistics. And another or last controversy is that what can studies of brain damage and language tell us? So, how can brain damages tell us about language and how they work? So, cognitive neuropsychology is another recent development that has led to advances in our understanding of psycholinguistics. Traditional neurology and neuropsychology have been concerned primarily with the questions about which part of the brain control different sorts of behavior. That is, when the localization of function and with working out how complex behaviors map onto the flow of information through brain structures. Now, the emphasis of cognitive psychology is rather different. The goal is to relate brain damage behavior to models of normal processing. For example, research on aphasia, the name for any impairment of language, including defect or loss of production or receptive aspects of written or spoken language as a result of brain damage, has greatly furthered our understanding of all aspects of language processing. So yeah, it's um, what you call this innovations in different aspects of neuropsychology has greatly involved or impacted our understanding of psycholinguistics. Now, to before I end my discussion, let me point out some of the few notes that is important of note taking. Now, psycholinguistics arose after the Second World War as a result of interaction between the disciplines of information theory and linguistics, and as a reaction against behaviorism. Modern psycholinguistics uses a number of approaches, including experiments, computer simulation, linguistic analysis, and neuropsychology. They even apply the use of early artificial intelligence. And these approaches to language include ELISA and the SHRDLU that gave the impression of comprehending language but had no real understanding of language and were limited on specific domains. So they can't really understand or explain how and why language works in the mind of human beings. Later, AI models of processing syntax use augmented transition networks, and it is unlikely that the human parser uses the same mechanism. And language processes can be broken down into a number of levels of processing. Okay, so that being said, they are not basically highly modular in a sense. Psychologists are divided about the extent to which the mind can be divided into discrete modules. An important question, particularly for the study of how we acquire language, is the extent to which language is innate. And whereas traditional approaches based on linguistics state that much of our knowledge of language is encoded in terms of explicit rules, more recent approaches based on connectionist modeling state that our knowledge arises from the statistical properties of language. But we don't basically know anything about this. We'll try to learn more about this in the semester for the subject. And lastly, double dissociation are important in the neuropsychological study of language. So yeah, that is all about the history, methods, themes, and controversies of psycholinguistics and modern psycholinguistics. I hope you learned a lot. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to message me. And thank you so much for watching and listening.